Now, my name is Runoko Rashidi. I've recently been awarded a doctorate degree, so you could call me Dr. Rashidi. I've kind of gotten used to that. I'm the author and editor of 9 books. I've been to Egypt 8 times now. I've visited 54 countries in the last 6 years. I'm very proud of that. I'm proud to say that I've lectured in 32 countries, and I believe I'm having an impact. I'm an African historian, not a historian who happens to be an African, but an African historian, and that means that my whole mission in life is using history to uplift African people. I reside in San Antonio, Texas, but I see myself as a citizen of the world, and it is simply an honor and pleasure to do the things that I do. I feel like I have been blessed by the ancestors and given a mission. I never thought I would be doing the things that I'm doing today almost routinely, and perhaps the lesson from that is that what from a distance oftentimes looks like an obstacle, as you approach that, what we perceive as an obstacle with vision and determination, in fact, becomes a stepping stone. And I am convinced that African people can do anything that we choose to do. And in a way, in my own humble way, I think I'm a living example of that. Well, this morning we have the great pleasure of being on the Giza Plateau. And in ancient times, during the time of the ancient Africans in Kemet, the area was actually called Kem, K-H-E-M. And this area is important because it is the scene of one of the wonders of ancient as well as modern times. And what we're looking at right behind me is what is called Khufu on the horizon, better known as the Great Pyramid of Giza. And we make these distinctions because there are at least 110 pyramids in Egypt alone, and this is the most famous and arguably the most important one. This one is made up of 2.3 million granite blocks, the average weight of which is 5,000 pounds, and some of them, I'm told, weigh up to 50,000 pounds. It sits on 13 acres of land, and one of the most remarkable aspects about it is that it wasn't cemented together. I think most people would think that a monument of this type must have been held together with some sort of mortar. But the Africans in ancient times cut these stones in such a precise manner that even now it is impossible to slide a razor blade, to put a piece of paper between them. Now, I think that several things need to be pointed out here. First of all, they weren't built by slaves. Now, that's a common notion, that slaves labored in inhumane conditions to build these monuments. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the Africans, the pharaohs, the Herus, took great pride in how the workers were treated. We even have a sense now of what the people ate, where they lived, you know, how much vacation time they had, the sandals that they wore, the oil they got to anoint their bodies. And so we know that they weren't built by slaves. They were built by free Africans and were in fact construction projects. Now, perhaps the most significant thing about all of this is how it relates to the African, in particular African American heritage. I think that most of us have a tendency to believe that we come from a race of nothings and nobodies. And so we come here in particular to see that nothing could be further from the truth, that Africans have a history of great achievement and nothing is greater than this. We don't really know exactly how these monuments were constructed. We can only guess, but the actual original plans have been lost. They were used largely as burial chambers for the kings. In fact, I believe this one was used as a burial chamber for the king, the queen, and even members of the family. And I think that if you look at this monument, which still staggers my imagination, although I've been here perhaps a dozen times, you get a sense of what African people can do by looking at what African people have done. And in a nutshell, I think this is the significance of this monument, which is called Khufu on the horizon. Now, the Greeks call this king Cheops, or Cheops, C-H-E-O-P-S, but the African name is Khufu, and we want to use the African names as much as possible. It was built approximately 4,600 years ago, but it still stands as a living testimony to the genius of African people. 2 questions have been raised. One is, what happened to the limestone? In other words, how has this particular monument changed from the time it was originally constructed about 4,600 years ago? And these are very good questions. I pointed out earlier that at one time, after the original construction, the outside of it was cased with limestone, the limestone polished and gleamed. But the limestone was stripped away by the Arab invaders of Egypt, who used it to build many of the mosques in what is now Old Cairo. And if you look closely, you can see that there's a hole in it, a gap that's been forced in there. That was not original. The idea must have been that a monument of this size must have contained a great deal of buried treasure. And as a result of that, some of that treasure was probably still inside, it was thought. And they couldn't find the original entrance to the pyramid. And so this hole was forced in there with the idea that they would find something of great value inside. And of course, that was never found. All kind of speculation has been brought forth about why the pyramids were constructed and who constructed them and all of that. In fact, I would say that this monument is a source of more pure speculation probably than any other monument in the world. And it's been said that this is the last of what are called the 7 original wonders of the world. And these wonders of the world were developed by the Greeks. And they include the Colossus of Rhodes, they include the Lighthouse of Alexandria, but this is the one monument that still remains intact. There have been earthquakes, there have been invasions, but this monument is essentially indestructible. And it is there for the whole world to see. It's been there again for 4,600 years, and I suspect that it'll be there for a lot longer. We're now in front of the Great Pyramid of Khafre. There are 3 large pyramids on the Giza Plateau. The first is built in the reign of a pharaoh named Khufu from Dynasty 4, and this is the pyramid of his son. Actually, there was another son involved, a man named Dadefre, but he is only on the throne for a short period of time, and his pyramid is never completed. So this is the second one, and for some people this is even more important than the first. This one is different in the sense that it still has some of the limestone on top, and so you get a clear idea on this one as to what they originally looked like. Again, this is built by a man named Khafre, and when I say built by, I don't mean that the pharaoh actually was the one who got out and did the physical labor, but he's the one who commissioned the construction of the monument. And this person is important also because he is not only responsible for this monument, but he's also important because he is the same person that commissioned the work on what we call the Great Sphinx, or Hormak, Heru on the horizon, and we will be seeing that in a bit. But anyway, this is a magnificent monument, not as precisely constructed as Khufu's. You can see it seems to have deteriorated a bit more. Perhaps he was in a rush to do it, perhaps there wasn't enough time. There's nothing quite like Khufu's, but this is the second best. And again, this is the pyramid constructed by the pharaoh, the monarch named Khafre, and we'll also be seeing images of Khafre in the Egyptian Museum in the city of Cairo itself. We're in front of the monument, the famous monument that is commonly called the Great Sphinx, and the Africans would have called it Hormakhet or Heru Akhet, and that basically means Heru on the horizon. Now this monument is in the form of, it has the body of a lion and the head of the monarch or the king or the Heru. This word pharaoh apparently was not used until relatively recent times, as I understand it, and the king was known as the Heru, or the living incarnation of God. And this monument serves as a kind of a guardian deity on the Giza Plateau. This is where we are. So you have this particular monument, world famous, in front of the pyramid of Khafre. And Khafre is important to us because he comes to us from Dynasty 4, and he's responsible for the monument, the big pyramid that you see behind you, which is the second largest pyramid on the Giza Plateau, and the Great Sphinx itself. Now, you can see the most obvious part about it is the face has been mutilated, and that it was done deliberately, we think. Done by 2 people. First, a group of white slaves, that's right, white slaves, called Mamluks, probably in the 13th century. They come out of Western Asia. They may have been actually from Turkey, but certainly Western Asia, and certainly Caucasoid. And then it was damaged again in 1798 by Napoleon Bonaparte, or the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon seems to have had a very vindictive side, and he took his anger apparently out on this monument. Now, he went inside the Great Pyramid, and he came out all in a rush and all upset. Nobody knows exactly why. And tradition says he trained his artillery on the face of this particular monument. Now, there's a story that I want to tell about that, and I think it's a very interesting story. And that is, you can see the face, the nose, the lips, even the chin has been badly damaged. And I think most people would think that that's the end of the story, but it's not the end of the story. And we find that most of those pieces are still scattered around the world. They haven't been destroyed. They've been scattered, they've been fragmented. But some of the pieces, some of the major pieces are in the British Museum, and other pieces are in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And to me, that story is kind of a metaphor for African people, because we've been shattered. We've been fragmented, we've been scattered all over the place, but we are trying to become whole again. And the Egyptian government has been demanding for some time that the British government return the faces, the pieces of the face of the Sphinx, which they've refused to do. But the idea that this monument is in fact indestructible, that the face has been knocked around but is still there trying to become whole again, I think is symbolic of African people. We've been through the slave trade, we've been through the Ma'afa, we've been through Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, and we are becoming whole again. And part of this journey to the black land of Africa, known as Kemet, is a part of that journey to go home and become whole again. And that's a story that I really like to narrate, because I think it's symbolic of African people, African heritage, African culture, and our tradition. Standing in the central courtyard of the Temple of Medinet Habu. This complex is largely the work of the great pharaoh of Dynasty 20, Ramses III, who has no relationship with Ramses the Great. We're in the central courtyard of the great temple on the west bank of the Nile in Luxor of Ramses III. Ramses III is the great monarch of Kemetic Dynasty 20, or Kemite Dynasty 20. He reigned for 31 years, and his reign is characterized by battles with the people known as the peoples of the sea. These are nomads coming out of southern Europe who attempted to invade Egypt on 3 occasions. And what you see before you are depictions of the battle scenes. One part is particularly interesting in that you see a collection of human hands, because the Egyptian warriors cut off the hands of the slain enemies as proof of their prowess in battle. This is the famous Step Pyramid, and the Step Pyramid is designed by the multi-genius Imhotep, the world's first scientist, and it has the distinction of being the first large building in stone on Earth. It's an African achievement par excellence. We are now in the city of Saqqara, a kind of a necropolis, a city of the dead, and this is the most outstanding monument there. Not many people get an opportunity to come on this side and actually look into the tomb chamber, and what prevents us from going all the way down are the loose rocks inside that make it very dangerous. Well, we're now in the Nubian Museum in Aswan. Aswan is the capital of Nubia, and this is the newest museum in the country. In a sense, it's kind of unfortunate, because what has happened is many of the finest aspects of Nubian or Kushite culture, many of the artifacts that had traditionally been housed in Cairo have been relocated here. Now, that's good for tourism here, because people can come and see it in a large, well-lit, spacious museum. But most of the tourists who come to Egypt don't come to Aswan. And so you don't see a lot of the Nubian Kushite artifacts in Cairo. And so the conclusion would be that the Kushite Nubian contribution to Egyptian civilization was minimal. Now, I wanted to start with this particular piece right here. I didn't see this in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. These are Nubian or Kushite archers. Sometimes this area is called Ta-Seti, which means the land of the bow. And you have 2 sets of soldiers. You have an Egyptian set or Kemite set, and you can tell the difference because they're a little bit lighter, a little browner. And more than that, they have javelins. The ones from the south, the Cushites or Nubians, have the bow and the arrow, consequently the land of the bow. There are 40 soldiers. They're made of wood. These are reproductions. These are not the originals. This comes from dynasties 9 and 10. And this is the first intermediate period. And this is a period of internecine warfare. You have different nomes or different administrative districts in Egypt at the time fighting for supremacy. And the very fact that you have these soldiers in the tomb is a reflection of that. You can see that each one is different. Each one has its own individual character. They're made of wood. There are 40 of them, and I think this is an appropriate place to start. These, in reality, would be dated to about 2000 BC, and these come from dynasties 9 and 10. These are not from the tomb of a monarch or a pharaoh, a Heru. These are from the tombs of a nobleman. So I wanted to, of all of the pieces in the Nubian Museum, there's no doubt in my mind that these are the two finest pieces right here. This one is of King Taharqa. Taharqa is the great figure of Dynasty 25. And as I commented in the lecture this morning, Dynasty 25, according to John Henry Clark, the great Dr. John Henry Clark, ancestor, John Henry Clark took us on our last great walk in the sun. This one used to be in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and it's been transferred down here. This is Taharqa's uncle. His name is Shabataka. Now let me go over the list, the chronology of the kings of Dynasty 25. You first have a man named Alara, A-L-A-R-A, and his son is Kashta. And Kashta goes from Kush to the city of Waset and declares himself king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Upper and Lower Kemet. And then you have the man named Pianki or Piye. He actually leads the army, and they reconquer most of Kemet. Now remember, this is Dynasty 25, about 715 BC. And prior to this period of time is the third intermediate period, which is a time of chaos and confusion and disorder. It's Fet. And so the kings from the south, from Kush, recognize that, and they come north to restore order. And so you have Pianki. This is Pianki's brother. And after Pianki, you have a man named Shabaka. And Shabaka is very important also because it's in the reign of Shabaka that you have the religious literature known as the Memphite theology, which is carved in stone. And Shabataka, during his reign, he introduces a new writing system that is called Demotic. And finally, you have Taharqa himself, who is the greatest figure during Dynasty 25. There's also a very important woman during that period of time, and that is the sister of Shabataka and the auntie of Taharqa. Her name is Amenirdas. And Amenirdas was the governor of the city of Waset. And the governorship during the 25th dynasty was passed down from auntie to niece and auntie to niece. These are really, really fine pieces. This one is made, I believe, of pink granite. The stone may have been quarried in walking distance of this museum. And this one, I believe, is made of basalt. But you cannot look at these images, particularly this one, and deny the African identity. Although some people have done just that. They have claimed that the Cushites themselves were not black people, were not Africans, but rather were dark-skinned white people, sometimes called members of the Mediterranean race or Hamites. And then, of course, this one right here is just a beautiful piece made of pink granite. James Henry Breasted wrote a chapter about this dynasty in his epic book, The History of Egypt, which, in spite of the racism, is a wonderful book. And he actually calls this period, along with another English historian named Arthur Weigall, the great epic of the nigger kings of Egypt. And this is the kind of history we have been getting. So this era has always been relegated to kind of a backwater in Egyptian history. Now tomorrow we go to Abu Simbel, and I want to point out one thing that you will see consistently, because you will see two sets of figures. You see, of course, the gigantic figure of Ramses the Great, Usamari Ramses II, and you have scenes of his conquest. For example, he fought a group of people called the Hittites at a place called the Battle of Kadesh, and he wrote about this victory in many of his inscriptions, or many of the inscriptions written about his reign. But tomorrow you will actually see the conquered people. You see the black people that were conquered in Inner Africa, and you see the Asiatics who were conquered in Western Asia. Now, a typical tour guide will point to the Asiatic, in other words, the white people who were conquered, and refer to them as prisoners of war. Africans in the same position he will invariably refer to as slaves. So this museum has a lot of significance, and these particular heads right here really never fail to capture my imagination. You can see here the facial features are largely intact, whereas in this one the nose has been deliberately chiseled off. The crown is made of gold. This would have had a uraeus right here. Neither of them, interestingly enough, have the pharaonic beard. But both of these pieces are from Dynasty 25. Dynasty 25 lasts from about 715 BC to about 650 BC. Taharka is the last great monarch, but Taharka's armies are defeated by the Assyrians. Okay? Now, I've spoken several times of the figure known as Amenirtis. And Amenirtis, again, is the great female figure of her time. I mentioned that the ancient people of Kemet had a matrifocal social structure with the emphasis on the female, and the line of descent is matrilineal, is traced to the female side of the family. But the Kushites were even more female-oriented than the Kemites were, probably because they were more in a traditional sense. Women are very, very important, even more important in Kush than they are in Kemet. In fact, it is from Kush that we have the female figures known as the Kintakas, that we sometimes call the Candace Queens. The word Kintaka means queen mother, and these are the great female figures from ancient Africa, at least from ancient Kush. And of all of the Kintakas, all of the great women at least, this is arguably the most important. This is a beautiful piece. I believe it's from the stone called basalt, a very hard stone, a very expensive stone, and this is originally from Karnak Temple. And here you see this great African woman with the traditional hairpiece, the wig, symbolizing power in and of itself. This is the uraeus that I continue to speak about. She has a very elaborate, almost unique crown, and it's very complicated. Here you see the crown here on top, and as our brilliant brother Jabari has pointed out, you have the symbol of the great goddess Heteru or Hathor here. You have the lunar symbol associated with the moon, and you have the cow's horns, but right in the middle are the double plumes of the god Amun. And of course, it's from the god Amun or Amun, Aman, which means the invisible one, the unseen one, the hidden one, that we derive in the Judaic-Christian tradition, the expression Amen, that everybody has heard before, but almost nobody would be able to tell you that it derives from an African source. You see the heavy hairpiece there, used for ceremonial purposes, and she has a kind of a flail. A flail is also a symbol of great power. If she was the monarch, she would have not only the flail, but also what is called the crook, because the monarch is sometimes called the good shepherd, and the shepherd is identified with the crook. And who else do we identify as the good shepherd? Of course, that's Jesus the Christ himself. So this is a beautiful piece, and in just standing here, I'm inspired because it gives me a chance to talk about the majesty, the power, the glory of African women and the respect that African women commanded in the Valley of the Nile. The head, in fact, cut off. I suspect that was done deliberately, and the remainder of the head is in all probability in a private collection somewhere or a European museum. But I just spoke about the goddess Heteru. Now, Heteru is one of the more ancient goddesses in Africa. She is spoken of as the Queen of Heaven and the Golden One. And she is the goddess of the marriage bed. She is the donor of, she is the protector of the king. Now, more often than not, when you see Heteru, commonly known as Hathor, you'll see her either, quite often you see her in the form of a cow. And why would that be? Because the cow, by its very nature, is protective. It provides milk, so she is a sustainer. And she here is identified with the face of a woman, but with cow's ears. And so this whole notion of Africans worshiping animals could possibly be addressed at this time. The Africans did not worship animals, but they did respect certain values in the world of nature or certain zoo types. So this is a particularly important piece. The Romans, I should say the Greeks, were enamored of Africa. The Greeks, in a sense, fell in love with Africa. although it was a kind of a destructive love in the long term. And they took a lot of the African deities and transposed them, incorporated them into the Greek pantheon. And so Hathor in the Greek world becomes Aphrodite. And in the Roman world, Aphrodite becomes Venus. But notice how her character changes. In Africa, she is a wholesome figure. She is a mother goddess. She is the matron of the king. Whereas in Greece, she becomes a promiscuous woman tantamount to a whore. In fact, the word aphrodisiac or aphrodisia is derived from the name Aphrodite. She is a loose and promiscuous woman, and the Romans take it a step further. As I heard a young man say today, they took her to the next level. And so Venus becomes her name, and the term venereal disease means the diseases of Venus. So you have a very profound instruction there, and that you move from Africa with one set of cultural values to Europe, where that culture is tremendously and dramatically distorted. Now, if you look on the side here, there's one other thing I want to point out, two things, if you can perhaps come this way. Okay, you can see two or three things of great interest, but the most important things that I want to point out are the symbology, or the symbols. You can see the Ankh, the key of life, the symbol of male and female union, deeply inscribed here, the same thing I have around my neck. And you can see, again, the beautiful metal-netter, or metal-netter, some people call it. You can see it inscribed here, but you don't see it with the precision that you find in Old Kingdom Egypt. And you can also see it right here, and you can see it on the king's or this figure's shoulder. Now, I can't read the language, but I can look at it and give you a pretty good idea as to the age of the monument. Now, this is another beautiful piece. You can see the face has been mutilated, at least the nose, but it nevertheless is a very, very beautiful piece. And again, this is not done by accident. This is done very deliberately. This is not a statue that would have fallen over and damaged or been damaged by an accident. And it's not a monarch. This was done by the forces, in all likelihood, of Napoleon Bonaparte, the French army that invaded Egypt in 1798. But again, I just want to point out the different the African language here, the medu-neter. Now, many people, when they look at Africa, they think of Africa as the hopeless continent, a primitive continent, a continent that has always been suspended in animation, that never had a history, that never had a culture. But this is the world's first writing system. Africans are the first people to produce a script. Africans are the first people to write a book. African people are the first people to develop religious literature, and this is an example of that. This is the earliest writing system in the world, and it's beautiful and inspiring to look at even now. Now, this was a writing system that was more or less monopolized by the priestly caste in Kemet, and later on you have a writing system, I would say by at least 2000 BC, called hieratic, a much more simple version of it, a much more cursive version of it, easier to write. And then, of course, we've already talked about Shabbataka and how he introduced the third writing system, which is called demotic. And that's our instruction for this particular piece. Now, this colossal statue is of one of the most powerful figures in ancient times. His name is Usamare, or Usamara Ramses the Great, or Ramses II. And he is the second person, obviously, to bear that name. He is the great figure of Dynasty 19. Dynasty 19 follows the chaos of the reign of Akhenaten. And Dynasty 19 is established about 1300 BC by a man named Ramses I, who was a general in the army of the last monarch of Dynasty 18, whose name was Horemheb. Horemheb was a mighty man himself on the throne for 25 or 30 years, who attempted to dismantle the monuments, the legacy of Akhenaten, who is oftentimes called the heretic king. After the death of Horemheb, his leading general, whose name is Ramses I, comes into power. But Ramses I is a very elderly man who is only the monarch, only the hero for 1 year. And he is in turn followed by his son, whose name is Seti I. And Seti I is very interesting for a number of reasons. One is he's the only bald-headed king that I've been able to find in ancient Egypt. And so naturally there's a sense of affinity that I can identify with Seti I. Seti I is a warrior king. and he leads his armies into battle once again in an attempt to reclaim the lost territory given up during the reign of the peaceful monarch Akhenaten. Seti I is on the throne for 10 years, and his greatest monument is at a temple complex called Abidu, which is not easy to get to. I should say Abydos. And of course, there are African names for it too, but archaeologists call it Abydos, and the Greeks call it Abydos as well. And this is a very interesting city. For example, it was about 10 years ago unearthed in Abydos under the sand were the remains of 18 wooden ships that date back to Dynasty II, almost 5,000 years ago. And this is the first known example of a naval fleet in history. So once again, we find a first associated with the people of ancient Kemet. So Seti I builds a temple there, and many people also believe that Abydos is important because it is believed to be the birthplace of the god Asar, commonly known as Osiris. In fact, there is a huge underground chamber outside the main temple that you cannot go into now with these huge lintel blocks on top. They must weigh 30 tons each. And you are forbidden to go there, and there's barbed wire that keeps you from going in there. But it is believed that there's an island on the inside of that where God Asar was actually born. Another very interesting thing as we get to this particular statue about Abydos is there is what is called the Hall of Records there. And in this Hall of Records, you see the king Seti I with his young son Ramses II. And he's pointing to a wall. And on the wall are the records of all the known kings of Kemet who came before him, perhaps 300 kings. And Seti I seems to be pointing to his son and saying, this is your legacy. This is what you must live up to. And finally, we get to Ramses himself. Ramses is the most prolific king in ancient times. He is credited with building more monuments than any king in ancient times. He's the greatest family man in world history. And he is not called Ramses the Great for no reason. His monuments stretch from the Nile Delta all the way to the very southernmost portions of Egypt and even past the Sudanese border. Now, this particular monument is a reflection of that. This is the largest image in the museum. This is called a colossal statue, and I think some of you may have seen something similar to it on the west bank of the Nile yesterday called the Colossi of Memnon. Ramses' work does not have the precision. It doesn't have the meticulous construction aspect of it that some of the other kings has. Perhaps Ramses was more interested in quantity than quality. But the very fact that a statue of this size of one of the most important monarchs in the history of Kemet is built this far south is an indication of the respect that the people in the north had for the southerners. The energy, the dynamism, the impetus for ancient Egyptian civilization always came from the south. It is very important to point out that the orientation of Egypt was from the south, not from the north, not from the east, not from the west, but from inner Africa. And indeed, they trace their lineage back to inner Africa. There's an inscription that I've been looking for a long time, a hieroglyphic inscription, a Medu Neter inscription that says, we came, speaking of the people of ancient Kemet, from the foothills of the mountain of the moon where God happy dwells. This would be the area near Kenya, Uganda, near the so-called Great Lakes region. So you always had this southern emphasis, and the fact that Ramses built this colossal statue deep down in the south was an attempt to show respect to the people of this region. And this is something contrary to what any typical tour guide is going to tell you. And this is nothing that a Eurocentric scholar is going to tell you, because they want to give you the impression that the ancient Egyptians somehow lived in Africa but were not African people. And this is the myth that we must seek to destroy. And I think the fact that we have a group of this size is an indication that we're in the process of the destruction of the Eurocentric mythology of ancient Egypt. Several things about this statue I could also point out. He is an ancestor here. You can see the feet are largely placed together, and he is in the Osirian posture. I think Brother Jabari has pointed out beautifully, consistently, that life would mean that one foot is placed in front of the other. He has the crook and the flail, the symbol of the good shepherd, the symbol of rulership. He has the pharaonic beard, another symbol of divinity or rulership. He also has the uraeus intact, and he has the double crown. Now, I've said over and over again that the African name for this country was Kemet, the black community. Sometimes it is called Tameri, which means the beloved land, and oftentimes it was referred to as the two lands because you have a kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south. But when Kemet was at its highest point, those two kingdoms were merged into one. And here you have the double crown representing that merger, that unification. Anybody knows that when you're united, you're strong, and when you're divided, you're weak. The crown on the bottom part is the crown from the north. And if this were in color, as I suspect it was at one time, because you can even see some of the paint on there, although this is 3,000 years old, some of the paint is still there for you to see. The crown from the crown from the north would have been painted red. And then the crown from the top the crown on top, the uppermost part of the crown, I should say, is from the south. And it looks like a kind of a bottle tilted to its side. So this is a magnificent piece with many, many, many lessons. If you can look on the back of it, you could see the tail of a bull hanging down. And once again, this reflects the astute observation of the zootype, or the world of nature. They didn't worship the bull. What did the bull represent? Strength, power, virility. In fact, one of the titles of the king is the mighty bull. And so this piece right here is a lecture in and of itself. You can see the metal netcher right there on his belt buckle. So this is a very powerful image, and it's placed in this position of prominence for a very good reason. Some of the members of the group have asked me to comment on the significance of the baboon. It's very, very easy. The baboon represented intelligence. And the baboon is associated with the deity Tahuti or Thoth, and it's from the name Thoth given by the Greeks that we derive the word thought. And so I can't stress enough, because a lot of us, virtually all of us, have a Christian orientation. And I think it's natural to look at these and talk about idolatry and the people of Kemet worshiping animals. These are very intelligent people that we're talking about. And this was a reflection of that. Of course, we're talking about, once again, the zootype, the world of nature, and the baboon is represented here simply because they represented intelligence itself, like the ibis bird that was spoken of yesterday. And then I want to comment on these two images to the right and the left. Now, this particular figure is interesting from the art, and you can see he's striding forward, which means life, as opposed to the figure of Ramses the Great, who is in the Osirian posture. We don't want to refer to that as the mummy posture, but rather the Osirian posture. But this figure is striding forward, which means life. And this image is from Dynasty 25. He is a high official. And you see an elderly man. And somebody had asked me earlier today about why I would make a distinction between the Cushites and the Kemites, because they were different. They were from the same gene pool, they were from the same ethnic group, but they were different nationalities, just like the Greeks and the Romans were different, just like the French and the British are different, just like the Germans and the Danes are different. Still the same Europeans, but nevertheless there are certain national distinctions that cannot be overlooked. And the Cushites were not the same as the Kemites. In fact, in all likelihood, the civilization of Cush is even more ancient than that of Kemet. But one of the differences, you can see the naturalistic portrayal. If you look, or you just saw a moment ago, the image of Ramses the Great, he looks athletic, he looks buff, even though he lived to be 99 years old. That does not reflect the phenotype of a 99-year-old man. But this is much more naturalistic. And so one of the differences is the art itself. And this kind of harkens back, in a sense, to the Amarna period, or the time of Akhenaten, where people were also portrayed in a much more realistic or naturalistic fashion. And I think that's the point that I want to illustrate here. You can see that many of these images in this museum are made of basalt, very hard stone. The object that you see before you is commonly called an obelisk. We believe the African name is Tekken. And there are 18 large ones, most of which have been taken out of Africa. There's one in Istanbul in Turkey. There are 3 in Rome. There's 1 in Paris. There's 2 in London. There's 1 in New York. And you have a handful of them right here. This has 3 basic functions. One is it's a phallic symbol. You don't have to go to London.
You don't even have to go to Washington, D.C. to see a replica of it. You can go to a graveyard, to a cemetery, because it represents resurrection. And the root of the word resurrection is erection. It is a male symbol, which you can see. And some people would even argue, as has been stated already on this trip, that it represents the missing organ of God Asar. But it is also a kind of a clock, perhaps the first clock. You could tell what time of day it was by the shadow caused by the reflection of the sun. And in addition to that is a victory monument. It has the name and title of the Heru, of the monarch, inscribed deeply in stone. Here we're talking about people who built to last for all time, who built to last for eternity, and who built with the idea of perfection in mind. We're not talking about a people who practice mediocrity, a people who practice good enough, it'll do, second best. They wanted it to be perfect, and they wanted it to last forever. And that is what we want. We want to be perfect, and we want a legacy that will last for all time, that will shine with the glory of our ancestors. And I've been saying two things that I think are pretty consistent. I spoke about it in my lecture this morning. One is to repeat the importance and prominence of the female in ancient Egypt. Women in ancient Africa were highly respected. Indeed, the worst thing that could happen to you in ancient Africa was for your mother to put a curse on you. Now, you know, a lot of people may not be aware of this, but you had capital punishment in the Nile Valley too. It was rare, but it did happen. But let's examine it and compare that to capital punishment in Europe. When you were given a death sentence in the ancient Nile Valley, typically, you would get a notice from the monarch, basically saying your time was up, that you were a detriment to society, but you were given an option. You could go home after you got the note. You could spend a final night with your family. You could put your legacy in order. You could have a final banquet. You could make love to your wife. You could kiss your children. And then you would be required to take your own life. In other words, you would be allowed to have a level of dignity. Now, in Europe, let us examine just the opposite of that. You have the record of people being guillotined. You have people being burned at the stake. You have people being drawn and quartered. Not only is the punishment gruesome, but it is a public humiliation. So you are not even allowed to die with dignity. Now, there was an African from ancient Kush who had a Greek visitor, and he was explaining this whole notion of death and capital punishment in the Nile Valley. And he explained it to the Greek, and the Greek said, well, why don't you just run away when you get that notice? You know, if it were me, I would run. And the Cushite said, we don't run because it would disgrace our families, and our mother would put a curse on us. And that was a fate worse than death. So this idea of respect for not only the woman, but for the mother figure was very profound. When we talk about ancient Africa, we're not just talking about statues. We're not just talking about writing systems. We're not talking about monuments, but we're talking about a kind of a morality and a set of cultural values that would be good for us to hearken back to. Those of us who are becoming conscious talk about the notion of Sankofa, which means to reach back and fetch it. Reach back and fetch the things that made us great. And that is why we have these pilgrimages to the Nile Valley, because we want to see the things that made us great, because we desire, like any people, to be great again. And so as we walk around this museum, we see aspects of the things that made us great. And this is a part of our legacy. This is a part of what we come to celebrate. This is a part of our history. This is a part of our story. And this is something that we will never, never forget.
Here we're talking about people who built, it has been said by people like Champollion, who deciphered the ancient language of Egypt. They built like men 100 feet tall. They built for the world to see. They built and established a legacy that has not been diminished. We talk about people who lived thousands of years ago, but who had a sense of mission and purpose in life, and therefore time has not diminished the glory of their deeds. And I think that this is why other people want to claim Egyptian civilization as their own. And this is why we have decided, this generation of African scholars, to make ancient Egypt the battleground. We are trying to reclaim our glory, and there's no better place to start than ancient Egypt. At the same time, I think the people of ancient Egypt, the Kemites, lived in an era before we were contaminated, before there was a sense of African inferiority. They were able to fulfill their largest ambitions. They were able to, I think, fulfill and complete their destiny. They themselves could be looked upon as a superhuman group of people. They refer to ancient Egypt not only as Kemet, the black community or the black city, and not only the two lands because of Upper and Lower Egypt, but they refer to it as Tameri, the beloved land. And you can see, I think, that love surrounding you everywhere you go. Most of the statues that you see, they have a very serene expression, a smile on their faces. And not just the kings and queens, but the ordinary workers, the reproductions of which we see in the museums. And so in many cases, I think you would have to conclude that ancient Egypt was a wonderful place, a wondrous land, and they seem to be beckoning us to return to the glories of ancient Africa. And they are here in the spiritual sense and in the physical sense of the statues and monuments to act as our guides. And I think that that is a marvelous thing. They built for eternity. They built with the idea of perfection. And again, time has not diminished the glory of those wonderful deeds.